We live at a time where shoppers are more conscious on what they consume, and food labels that were once used mainly for marketing purposes are now also what allows you to determine what exactly are in the food products you buy and eat. The lines get blurry, however, when food labels are misleading and use terminology that might be perceived as healthy, but when in reality is not what you think. In this video, we will reveal to you food labeling that is misleading and what you need to be aware of so you can be a more educated consumer and not be fooled by deceptive food labels. Make sure to stick around to the end of the video, as this is a gold mine of information. Share this video with someone you care about, smash on the like button, and subscribe if you haven't already. Now let's get right to it. Number 1. Whole grain bread. A key essential in our everyday lives, as bread keeps us full and is also a healthier alternative than the processed and refined white flour breads. So when you come across whole grain bread at the market, you might think, hey, is it a healthier source of bread, right? Well, get ready, because you're going to want to hear this. If you see a label on breads that say made with whole grains, then you should know that only a slight amount of whole grains are required in order for bread producers to be able to put that on the label. Matter of fact, according to Spoon University, refined white flours with just a minimal amount of wheat added to it can be allowed to carry the label of whole grains. Now, according to the Health Cleveland Clinic, whole grains do consist of healthy vitamins and other health benefits. However, if the whole grains are processed and refined, then the healthy outer layers get stripped off, thus making really the bread without all those healthy vitamins and minerals you thought you were consuming, obviously removing the healthy factor. The article advises to look for labels that says 100% whole grain or even ones with a whole grain stamp to avoid buying breads that are mentioned before that is refined and enriched, which means that the grains has most likely been processed.
You want to make sure that you pick the healthiest options, and that can mean navigating a bunch of confusing labels on a simple loaf of bread.
The reason they can, quote, get away with it is because they want to market their product to that health-conscious consumer that everyone is turning into.
Finally, whole wheat is another red flag to watch out for. If the label doesn't say whole grain, then your product can technically have processed flour in it.
Number 2. The AllNatural label. Have you ever seen this label on food products that you purchase? Consciously, you think of a food that has no preservatives, GMO, pesticides, chemicals, and any other artificial ingredients. The word AllNatural draws you in and can be the difference between buying one product over another. I mean, that's what AllNatural means by definition, correct? Well then, get ready for the big surprise. The reality is, there's no universal word or governing body that decides what can be labeled as AllNatural on food products, as you can see so on the FDA website itself. So in other words, it doesn't mean anything, and food companies are free to use that word without having to withhold a level of standard, with no enforcement on the use of the all-natural food labeling.
Consumers think that it means a lot more. In fact, they think it means no artificial ingredients or colors, no GMOs, for example, no pesticides. For meat, they think it means no drugs, that the animals were raised outside and led some sort of natural life. And it doesn't mean any of this.
Natural doesn't necessarily mean what you think.
The buzzword at supermarkets these days is natural. You see it on all kinds of packaged foods.
I would prefer to buy natural over non-natural.
Yes, I look for natural because I feel like it's healthier.
Ultimately, the all-natural really means what the food seller wants it to mean. With this lack of regulation, you can imagine this is being used freely on foods that are far from all-natural. For instance, NBC News covered a few of these supposed all-natural food labeled, which in fact do contain chemicals and GMO ingredients. In order not to be misled, look out for food labels that say USDA organic, as these are regulated by the USDA. Number 3. The zero and trans fat free label. We covered this topic briefly on this video, but this is a topic that is worthy of mention again to make sure you, our subscriber, is aware of some of the deceptive labels and marketing practices and what you're allowing yourself and the ones you care about to consume. So you walk into the supermarket and you see a food product that says trans fat free or zero trans fat. On first glance, you would think it carries no trans fat. After all, why else would they dare put the trans fat free label on it if it wasn't? Well, there's a loophole to this. According to the FDA, any foods that contain less than 0.5 grams of trans fat can be rounded down to zero, thus allowing sneaky food companies the wiggle room they need to slap on the zero trans fat label. Before you think 0.5 grams of trans fat is barely anything, I want you to think of this. Imagine yourself eating foods or snacks that have 0.5 trans fat, but is being labeled as trans fat free. You end up eating 5 of those, let's say, for example. Now you've already consumed 2.5 grams of trans fat. If you eat this multiple times during the week, your trans fat consumption will just keep increasing, all the while that you think that there's zero trans fat because of the label. Deception at its finest.
And zero trans fat products are super deceiving. Oftentimes, companies make the serving size so small, making the percentage of trans fat zero, when actually there is some in the product.
Number 4. The infamous low sodium labels. I personally see this everywhere now when I am shopping at the market. The mainstream nowadays is well aware of the dangers of a high sodium diet that is linked directly to hypertension, heart, and kidney disease. So what do food companies do in response to their ultra salty products? Slap on the low sodium labeling. But is it truly low sodium? Now let's analyze this for a second. Let's take a can of Spam for instance. I was personally initially drawn in by the 25% less sodium labeling as when compared to the Spam Classics, so I thought this was going to be a healthier option. But once you study the nutritional facts on the Spam, you notice how confusing it can get. The 25% less sodium equates to 580 mgs of sodium, but that's per serving, not the entire can of the Spam. This can be misleading if someone were to take a quick glance at it. Now check this out. This can of Spam contains 6 servings per container. So if you were to eat the entire can of Spam, you will take that 580 mgs of sodium and times it by the 6 servings per container, and you will get a whopping 3,480 mgs worth of sodium just from eating this one can of Spam. Even if you eat one serving of the Spam, which is an extremely small amount, you're still consuming 580 mgs just from a couple of slices. So much for low sodium products, so pay attention to these labels and don't be misled.
Dr. Yoni Friedhoff.
It says it's less sodium.
All right, well, let's talk. Campbell's Healthy Request Soup. Lots of feel-good ingredients like whole grains and vegetables, and 25% less sodium than Campbell's other soups. But
You might read that and think that it's going to be a low sodium choice. But if you want to look at the label and try to figure out what's in it, you're going to have to do some pretty fancy math.
that's because this bowl holds 398 milliliters of soup, but the nutritional information on the side only for 250 mils, just 2/3 of the container. Who's going to eat 2/3 of this container of soup?
No one.
I wouldn't. I'd open it up. I'd eat the whole thing. And if you do that, the actual amount of sodium in this Healthy Request soup climbs to 750 milligrams. That's more sodium than this entire bag of salt and vinegar chips.
And that's half of the recommended daily amount.
In one serving of soup.
In one serving of soup that says it has 25% less sodium than comparable.
Number 5. The no nitrates added labels. It's obvious these days that deli meats and other processed meats are not the healthiest options and they're considered carcinogenic, as we covered in this video. One of the main culprits to this are nitrates, which is a preservative used to help cure the processed meat and extend shelf life. Many health-conscious customers might be duped to think labels with no nitrates added are a healthier alternative, but that might not simply be the case. According to an article by NPR, processed meats that carry labels that say no nitrates added may in fact carry the same amount of nitrates as foods without the label. To make sense of this, when food companies use natural curing agents such as celery powder instead of the synthetic sodium nitrate, they're required by federal guidelines to put no nitrates or uncured under labeling. As there's no real regulation of what can be labeled as no nitrates added, food companies can also add this labeling as they choose to market their food products, but it's misleading to the would-be consumers who believe that this is a healthier option. Now, the Center of Science in the Public Interest and Consumer Reports had already submitted a petition to the USDA in 2019 to make changes to the rules of no nitrates added labeling.
So what's happened is a lot of manufacturers have actually started using naturally occurring nitrates and nitrites instead of the synthetic ones, and they're also labeling their products nitrate-free or no nitrates added. Yeah. We've got to read the small print. That fine print is really where we have to hone in. If we take a look at this fine print, it says no nitrates except those naturally occurring in celery powder. So even though it said before no nitrates added, it then says, but wait, except those naturally occurring, and that's what's happening.
Thank you for sticking around to the end of the video. If you'd like to see a part 2 of misleading food labels, let us know in the comments below. You'll be surprised at how much misleading labeling that's out there and how many consumers have been duped. Leave your comments on any suggestions on any future topics you'd like to see covered on this channel. Until then, share this video and stay informed. Genius Tomato out.